This is live, right? Well, good evening and welcome to our lecture series. Thank you for being patient. We always allow a few extra minutes for those who have trouble parking here at Stanford, which can be difficult, or getting through construction. I'm Cathy Blake. I'm the Associate Director of the Campus Planning and Design Office, and I'm also the University Landscape Architect. And welcome to our fourth lecture in the 2015 Architecture and Landscape Architecture Spring Lecture Series. Last year, the lectures investigated the theme of origins. This year's theme is the movement. Architecture today does not seem to have a clearly definable formal movement, or at least no architect will admit to one. Some architects have strove to understand the past and our traditions. Some have endeavored to capture the spirit of our age, zeitgeist, and others have speculatively attempted to create the architecture of the future. So, we've asked this year's lecturers to simply explain what is your architecture, or in this case, landscape architecture, and of the moment. I want to thank Nichelle Hagan from our office, as well as John Barton, the director of the Stanford Architectural Design Program, for organizing this series. We're honored to have such outstanding professionals join us each spring. Also, I'm asked to remind you, next week's lecture is Architect Jeannie Gang. It will be on Thursday instead of Wednesday in this same space. So don't come Wednesday. And thank you to the American Institute of Architects Santa Clara Valley chapter for their help in advertising the series and registering our program for continuing professional education. If you haven't done so, please sign up in the sheet out in the lobby on the clipboard if you need continuing education credits. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Reed, principal of Stoss Landscape Urbanism. Okay. Chris is the founding principal of Stoss. His innovative hybridized approach to public space has been recognized internationally, and he's been invited to participate in competitions and installations in the United States, Canada, Europe, Israel, the Middle East, Taiwan, and China. Reed's research interests include the impact of ecological sciences on design thinking and city-making strategies informed by the landscape systems and dynamics, all a part of what I call the East Coast movement, landscape urbanism. We don't hear that term here as much, but Chris hopefully will describe a little bit about what that is. Chris is co-editor of a recently published volume of research and drawing titled Projective Ecologies. He received a Master in Landscape Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania and an AB in Urban Studies from Harvard College. He is currently Associate Professor in Practice of Landscape Architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. So please give a warm welcome to Chris Reed.
Terrific. Thanks, Cathy. Thanks to John. Thanks to everyone here at Stanford. It's really a privilege to be here. It's also fabulous after a long winter in Boston to come out to a place so beautiful. I've always thought I should be from California. I'm not, but I really should be out here. Tonight, I'm going to give a talk that I've never given before. I was provoked by the page-long description. Cathy read just a small paragraph of it that described what many of the lecturers might take on. How is it that we reflect on our own work right now, and what are some of the pressing questions really at the center of what we do? I took that seriously. Oftentimes I don't take that seriously, and I just give the same talk. But this one I took seriously, so up until about 4 o'clock I was switching around slides and all that. So you're going to get a talk that is honest and an honest response to this question. It's a great sort of project for me to kind of take this on and say, okay, what really are we doing and talking about? But it'll be a little bit raw, a little bit unscripted, but that'll be fine. The firm itself is a landscape architecture firm plus urban design plus planning. From the moment I started the firm, I had this question, or a form of this question, in mind. How might landscape play a more prominent and formative role in the way that we imagine and also remake public spaces, infrastructure, and entire cities? This is not a landscape architecture that starts with plants or horticulture, although that's very much a part of it. This is landscape architecture that starts from the position of city making, of large-scale systems, of large-scale infrastructures, and how it is that we can coordinate these systems, sometimes at very, very large scales, in order to generate the work that we're doing. So even though you will see flowers and lush plants in the work we do, that's often not our starting point. And what I want to do tonight is give you a little bit of a sense of what many of the starting points are for our work and what some of the breadth of issues are that we've been taking on in the last few years. As Cathy says, I teach, I do research, and I practice. Oftentimes, teaching is a great opportunity for me to step back from practice, to take on bigger issues of climate change and what their implications are on the way that we make cities, the way that we live. For a number of years, we've been working in and around New York City, looking at very dynamic coastlines and how it is that you begin to plan for development, plan for city fabrics and neighborhoods in ways that really might acknowledge the dynamics that are taking place, trying to find a way to live with those dynamics as opposed to simply resist them. And some of the work is quite speculative. Some of it doesn't quite look like city making to the commoner's eye. But there is a lot at work here that's looking both at the very basic building blocks of a city, and at the same time looking at the way that dynamic ecologies might begin to inform that. I've also done some work, particularly in Central and Southern California, a lot of research work on the extended metropolitan infrastructures associated with Los Angeles. And we've looked at a number of systems, water systems, et cetera, and the consequences of those systems. So this student pair did some work in the Owens Valley, a place that is now consumed by dust storms as a result of the lake being dewatered. And these students were interested in cultivating new techniques for how to restore some of those ecologies, how to make some of what's going on evident to the folks who are out there on tours or in doing visits, but also to look at ways that we might begin to replant or recatalyze some of the ecological processes that have been lost on sites like this. I also do a little bit of research. Cathy mentioned a book that I published with an ecologist last year. This book looked at the relationship between ecological research on the one hand and design thinking over the last 20 years and also looking forward. When I learned ecology, I think when a lot of you learned ecology, not the students, I'm looking at some of the other folks in the room, we all learned about steady-state ecosystems, climax forests, those sorts of things, that the idealized state of nature was this stable system. That whole idea has been turned on its head. So now the idea is that environments are always in a constant state of change, a constant state of flux. And how is it that we begin to use that knowledge to begin to inform the way that we think about designing landscapes and designing cities? The book itself has a number of essays, but also has a number of drawings by ecologists. This is Richard Foreman. The previous one was H.T. Odom, very famous ecologists who have had a lot of impact on the way that designers think. We've also collected and cataloged a series of drawings by designers that really try to embrace the new dynamics of ecology and begin to work through what the implications are for landscapes going forward. This is a very famous drawing by Field Operations for a project in the mid-90s, drawing which in many ways kind of got this ecological movement going. And then where's the future of some of this work? And this is some of my work with students looking at new technologies, new software modeling technologies as a way to begin to advance some of these same ideas. But most of the time I practice. They forget this at school, but I do practice. And typically we practice in the public realm, whether we're working for cities, public agencies, institutions, or developers. Oftentimes on projects like this. This is the Isabella Stewart Garden Museum Edition in Boston, located right next to Olmsted's historic Fens. So a very culturally sensitive environment, a Venetian palace that was built in the 19th century with, it seems like a very kind of crude exterior, but once you get into the interior, you have the most lush, beautiful courtyard gardens. Courtyard gardens that are constantly changing, 10, 12 months a year. And of course, Isabella Stewart Gardner had an amazing art collection that's hung on the walls of the building. In the interior rooms between the courtyard and the exterior. And now it's open to the public as a museum. This was the historic museum. They were busting at the seams and wanted to think about a way to not only add space, but maybe as a way to open themselves up now to the city after having been cloistered in this kind of Venetian palace for so long. So you see here, this is the old building, the palace. This is the Fenway, and this is a public park that sort of extends that. This is the new L-shaped building that's part of it, along with all the gardens and landscape in between. The new building radically opens itself to the city. It opens itself to the Fens and to the landscape around it. It does so not only by opening the building but to the gardens, but creating these very clear connections between the interior gardens and the exterior city. It does so on both sides of the museum building so that you always have a sense now of the life of the museum, the life of the gardens as you're moving around and through the city around it. It was also important, this is Renzo Piano, to set up these interior-exterior relationships. So you now, when you're sitting in the library, feel like you're sitting in the garden. So a lot of transparency here was utilized. And a lot of choreography of how is it that we can use landscape to intensify architectural moments. This glass corridor here is the connection between the new building and the old building. You now enter the new building and then go through this glass corridor. As you do, you go through an archway of planting. So the architect was very interested in making sure that landscape resonated in people's mind as they now enter the old part of the museum. And also things like the greenhouses were now given a public presence on the street so that the horticultural workings of the museum could also have a public face. But there's more to this story, and it goes to the first of the questions that we focus a lot on in our work. How do we put landscape and ecology to work for us rather than just being a kind of setting for other things to happen? When the palace was initially built, it was built on fill. This is the center of Boston. Now, Boston has filled in all of these mud flats. The Gardner Museum, the Fenway, is about here. So all that area was filled in the 19th century. And you can see that again here. This is from Beacon Hill, looking back. And so the site of the Fenway is somewhere in this mucky mess back there. It was part of a big city building movement. Here you can see it, the outline of the fens here, the new back bay, and then this is the Gardner Museum. Gardner built the house to be a museum upon her death. But what's interesting about it, because it was all fill, all the buildings in the back bay in this part of Boston were all built on wooden pilings. Over time, because we now drain all of our stormwater into pipes and then that goes right out to the river, the groundwater level kept diminishing. What that would do is expose the wooden pilings to air, causing them to disintegrate. And so Boston reached a crisis point where they realized, a good portion of their 19th century building stock might collapse simply because the water wasn't there to preserve the wood pilings anymore. So every inch of stormwater that now falls on a site like this has to be absorbed into the ground, returned to the ground in place, not carried off. So there are extensive techniques of using a lot of green to simply allow the water to fall onto the ground. We're capturing all the water from the rooftops and putting that into cisterns, which then allow for water to infiltrate as well. And that same strategy is extends all the way to the curb here, where a very simple set of green infrastructure techniques. This is a continuous planting bed that nourishes the trees, structural soil. All of that is permeable paving. So every inch is captured and goes back into the ground and not onto the street. Even the parking lot functions in this way. So it's quite an interesting situation where this hydrologic issue has exposed a construction issue, and now the landscape has to be put to work to help correct this longer-term issue that the whole city's dealing with. In some ways, that project is really quite straightforward and simple in the way that it deals with water. At other times, we're trying to make these connections to ecology a bit more explicit. This is not such a pretty site. This is a site on the port of Milwaukee. This is a working port, and as you can see, it's across from the city's sewage treatment plant. So it's pretty hardcore. It's a site that had been filled, industrialized, and we were asked to make a plaza there for people. If you go back to this image, you'll notice there aren't really any buildings around there either. And so one of the first questions we asked was, who is this plaza for, given that there's no neighborhood? It's the first time we showed up to a public meeting to consult with the public, and nobody from the public showed up to talk to us. So that was one of the issues. Eventually, a few condominium buildings were built along here, and in fact, a river walk was being built along the Milwaukee River here, and this became a pivot point to connect then out to the lakeshore system. This is the site as we found it. There was no ecology here. The site was dead. There were no environmental dynamics at all. And so our simple goal in the project was to re-inaugurate some ecological and environmental life in the project, and to make that evident to the people who might come here. We did that simply by redirecting stormwater flow that was already happening on the site. And what we did was we captured every inch of it again and allowed the water either to infiltrate through the ground to the groundwater table, or to make its way all the way down to the edge of the water, where we allowed the surface water to feed a new wetland, a reconstituted native wetland, very much like the wetland that had once been there. that was displaced by industry. And so we're using this on-site resource, this on-site waste resource, really to inaugurate new environmental change on the project. At the upper end of the plaza is this grove that protects the site from the cold winds coming off the lake. That grove then gradually opens up to a lawn and paving surface, and then eventually the site steps down to this new marsh condition, a marsh which is incredibly luxurious in terms of the way that it changes over the course of the season. But it's really through the redirection of the stormwater resource that we're able to inaugurate a whole new set of environmental dynamics on the site. What's interesting, too, is that this lower area of the plaza will flood at heavy rainfall. And you can see we've also cut slots into the bulkhead wall here so that when the river level is really high, we're giving a place for the water to go. So we're giving water a place in the city, in the plaza, so that people can begin to develop a closer relationship with the environment. You can also see here how the plaza steps down as it approaches the river. And of course, this then makes for a nice amphitheater setting where the performance is really the performance of the river, the performance of the environment that people are there to take in. And it's not just people who are new to the neighborhood, who are just visiting the site, but it's some of the old folks too, who are there, who have been there the whole time, and frankly are now getting cleaner water in the river, which is producing healthier fish populations, which is making their fishing days much more productive. We also look at the potential to use building systems to generate new or regenerate ecologies that had once been in places. We've done a little bit of work in Dubai along the coast of the UAE, a place where heavy development has displaced a lot of the native mangrove swamps that were there. So we took on a project, a big development project, to say, hey, is there a way that we can actually use the waste resources from the development itself to feed a new set of mangrove gardens? So we worked with engineers on this development project to figure out how we could capture all the gray water from this development project, clean it, and use some of the landscape terraces associated with the site to help clean the water, upgrade the quality of that water. And as the water became cleaner and cleaner, we would then create a series of gardens for people where we would recreate mangrove habitat, but in the form of gardens. At this point, the mangroves themselves are also cleaning the water, creating new habitat, and you get this lush, new, shady set of gardens right along the seashore as a kind of cultural version of an ecological condition. We're also recently working with AC condensers and the water that's generated from AC condensers on a development project, with the idea that once the water from the air conditioning units is captured, it can then be put under a dome into a big waterfall situation that creates this incredibly humid and moist environment, and then plant a series of very lush botanical gardens in an enclosed space, not using new energy, but using the waste resources from the building system that's already there. So creative ways to use waste resources to generate new kinds of ecologies within the city. All right, second question. These are not in any particular order, and sometimes the sequencing doesn't make sense. How can we bring a more playful approach to play? I hate playground equipment. My kids sometimes hate playground equipment too. It's gotten better over the last few years. But for me, when I started having kids, or my wife had them, I tagged along, I guess. I would watch as the kids just simply walked along the street, and they would make games of hopping from one manhole cover to another. Any marking on the ground they could make a game of. And so there's this idea about creative and free play, that kids are especially curious creatures and they'll just make a game of anything. And we wanted to tap into a little bit of that and really explore the notion of play in the public environment. We became very obsessed with poured-in-place rubber. That's this material. You see it in a lot of playgrounds these days. It's soft and squishy. It's usually made from recycled tires or sneakers or something like that. Oftentimes, it was being used in very flat applications. And we kept playing with the idea of introducing topography in order to create environments that we thought might be more playful. We tried this with a city project that we had, and they were very worried that the techniques that we were using hadn't been tested. So we had the opportunity to test this in a garden festival up in Grand Métis, Quebec. This is a garden festival that's run every year. They're a set of old gardens, and then they do an international garden festival with a number of changing gardens. We named our installation Safe Zone. And what we did was use all the safety products that we could find that are typically used in landscapes. Not only the poured-in-place rubber, but rubber mulch, warning strips to make sure that everybody was aware as you entered the garden this was maybe not a safe place, as well as bumpers for trees. You'll see those in a moment. And essentially we sculpted the rubber across this very undulating landscape in order to create a number of conditions that we thought people might be interested in exploring. Here you can see a three-dimensional version of it. We happened to get this site that was wooded, which was also great. The rubber is permeable, so it allows the water through to the tree roots as well. But since there were trees there, we thought we had to give those guys bumpers as well, either to protect the trees from the kids or to protect the kids from the trees. We weren't quite sure. So this is what it looked like in its first version. And so the yellow and black here is the poured-in-place rubber, and the blue is the loose rubber granules. And of course, as soon as kids were allowed into it, they immediately took to it and started playing games and running and bouncing over the surface. You can see here how they run up and down. Kids are amazing at the way that they will just engage a landscape like this. We're also fortunate to have the construction supervisor kind of push people into the project. He had to do that with adults. Kids would go in. He'd also encourage adults to take their shoes off so they could really feel the squishiness of it. We also did something quite insidious. The code that you use for the thickness of the surface depends on the distance of your fall. So if you're falling from a high distance, you have to do a much thicker mat, which is much springier. And if you are falling from a low distance, it's a much thinner mat. So we varied the thickness of the mat, so it was thin on the top, thick on the bottom, which meant as you ran over it, the resistance to your foot on the ground would change, often causing you to fall into one of the pits or into the person that you were running with, which of course was part of the fun, at least our part of the fun. Adults did take to it. They did have to be pushed. It was also a garden festival, so they offered cocktails as well to get people getting into it. But you can see at a certain point, even middle-aged guys like this guy, finally got it and was just kind of running around and having fun. And we have this great collection of photographs that just talk about the way that people will engage an unfamiliar situation and make do with it and have fun and invent a way to inhabit a space like this. This has had a lot of impact, not only on the way that we design playgrounds now, but also in the way that we think of public space. We're currently working on unusual project. It's a streetscape project that's meant for movement. It's in a tough working class neighborhood in Syracuse, New York. It's a neighborhood that suffers from obesity, and the client wanted to make a streetscape that was all about movement and encouraging people to move. This was a competition, so it's all about taking 5 blocks along the street, along with a couple individual lots, and finding ways to encourage people to move. So we have one site that's all about spinning, using spinny things and swings and all sorts of things. We have one site that's all about climbing, where we've taken the rubber surface of the ground and kind of put it up on the wall and created an environment for people to kind of climb up onto the wall of a building and using netting. And then probably the most fun part of it, the bouncy space. This is a space both with an undulating topography and an overhead net. You can see it here as a way to simply encourage people to get out and exercise. But we've added a twist to this one in that we're also interested in using this technology called piezoelectricity, where as you bounce on a panel, it'll generate electricity, and in this case, will also generate light. So the idea is if we can embed this in the surface, as somebody hops around the site, different parts of the site will be illuminated. So they can create a game of moving around the site as they're bouncing from one place to another. These experiments have all led to not just the way that we think about playgrounds, but the way that we think about social spaces and people, and the way that we design for people to engage space, public space, in ways that are sometimes familiar, sometimes unfamiliar, really engaging their sense of curiosity. We're quite interested in the things that people do, not only when they're doing some activity or hanging out with their friends, but we're also interested in the odd and funny things that people do as well. This is on the campus of Harvard. You've got a lot of students just kind of sleeping. You've got this guy just chilling out in Green Bay. He has not a care in the world. He has just found his space and he's pretty happy. Or the way that people will find their own space. These are 2 of my favorite ladies who have decided they're going to make their own street front cafe by squeezing themselves in between 2 cars. This is just the stuff people do. And we want to play on that, play off that, and use that thinking as we begin to design public spaces as well. And so the question here becomes, how can we instigate social interactions and animate social space? Not landscape as a background, but something that really kind of encourages people to get out and do things. Of course, there are some historical references here. This is a drawing by Larry Halprin, a landscape architect. This is the Charlottesville Mall project. Of course, his wife was a choreographer. And so they made all these notations about the way people might move through public space, and then we kind of build a design around their movement. We also refer to the work of William White, who studied people's behavior in public spaces, not as a designer, but as a sociologist. How is it that people moved, in this case, across the plaza in front of the Seagram's building in New York, according to the time of day, whether it was lunchtime or not, and according to where the shadow of the buildings nearby fell. And so in even these mundane spaces, he was finding some really interesting information on the way that people behaved. We used some of that on the redesign of this space at Harvard University. This is historic Harvard Yard here. This is a tunnel, a road tunnel that had been sunk so that the campus could be extended over. And we've got a 1972 building by CERT, historic building here. There's a Pete Walker tenor fountain right at this location, and of course some of the oldest buildings at Harvard Yard here, as well as new dorms from the 80s here. So complicated site. Harvard finally gave us a project, and they gave us their toughest site and said, you know, go at it, but you have no ground. There's nothing underneath you but roadway. This is the site as we found it. Pretty bad shape. It was really a cut-through site. 10 to 15,000 people a day, we're told, moved through this space. But they moved as quickly as possible. There was nothing to do in that space. Sometimes the weather was really raw. And you can see it's quite worn out. It's fairly narrow paths. You had tour groups. The university would often put tents out there, but the tents would become quite muddy during the events if it rained. And so it was an overly used space, but it wasn't a space that was designed for any of these uses. It was intense in terms of its circulation because you had all the folks moving between the main campus and the north campus of Harvard, but also this is Harvard Square, where there's a T-stop, and you've got people moving through that space to go to their residential neighborhoods to the north as well. So we had to design it to accommodate flows of people first, and of course we choreograph the ways in which they might move through that space, but notice we're not trying to keep them on individual pathways. We're creating a surface where people can move across that surface a little bit more fluidly. The surface is very simple. The project's very simple. It's really about pavers and benches that accommodates not only movement of pedestrians, but also movement of bicycles through that space. In some ways, it's a radical transformation. It looks simple, but the surface itself is really highly engineered. You've got tent foundations, you've got utility hookups, you've got water, you've got power, you've got lighting, you've got all the functions that you need in order to host an array of events on a changing basis. The university was very interested in using this as a central destination space for people across the university community and the community at large to come together. So we began to design the space around different configurations of programs and activities, setting up the site in different ways and allowing a built-in flexibility to the site that allows for things like crafts fairs, music festivals, lunchtime music concerts, farmers markets, boxing matches by the student boxing club, formal performances by folks they bring in, ice skating during the winter, even curling during the winter. You can see a little bit of the snow from this past winter. So it's become even public protests. This was the first time. The university has been so good at programming the space that it wasn't until this past December that the space was quiet enough for students to lead a protest. And it was great to see it being used as a real civic space. And so we have our own choreography, our own schedules about the way that that space is constantly utilized as this new flexible space. But we also wanted it to be used for the everyday. It wasn't just going to be a destination space that was then empty the rest of the time. So we took care to do things, design seating, in ways that would encourage people to linger. We have a philosophy: if you give people a place to sit, if you give them food, and you give them something to do, you've pretty much created a pretty good public space. We spent a lot of time on the seating here. We were interested in creating benches that weren't one type fits all. So you can see here the way that these benches work. They have different heights of back, different elevations of where the seat is. There are also variations in the surface of the seat so that you can have one, sometimes two people. The idea was to create flexibility within the seating so that people could really pick their own place. They could find the spot that's most comfortable for them, for their bodies, or would that best fit their mood for that particular day. So you can see people sitting, people lounging, chilling out here. This guy's scratching his belly at lunch, but he's just, he's found his own place to be comfortable within that space. A mother and some kids. These sorts of benches are designed in a way that allow people to just kind of find the place that's most comfortable for them. And it's used, as you see, in conjunction with movable furniture that allows people to move things around as well. Very complicated project with a lot of utilities, but even the real hardcore infrastructure of the project is civilized. This is a crash wall that prevents a truck moving at 30 miles an hour from going over the edge and landing on some of the traffic beneath it. But we designed these crash walls so that they would have wayfinding signage, they would incorporate seating, they would even have a bike rack at the symbolic heart of the campus. They were well designed to play on light conditions. The concrete elements had a number of different wayfinding devices. This guy looks like Alex Krieger. I don't know if any of you know Alex Krieger, the urban designer. It cracks me up that a guy that looks like Alex Krieger, who's been teaching at Harvard for many, many years, needs to look at our map to figure out how to get around. But of course, the site also works in terms of utilizing stormwater. A lot of the stormwater is collected off to the side where we do have a little patch of ground, and we use it there to water this really intense planting grove with a set of spaces, garden spaces carved out of the grove so that you have quiet areas just alongside some of the more active areas. So again, you're giving people choice and flexibility to do what they want to do while they're there, as opposed to doing what we think they should be doing. Similar kinds of thinking lay behind some of the work on the waterfront at Green Bay, Wisconsin. This is a 1/4 mile of riverfront, a place where the city had turned its back to the river, and now with the new mayor, we were helping them rediscover their riverfront. Again, seating was key, giving people different choices about where and how they could sit, and setting up flexibility within the landscape as well was really important. You can see bike riders in paved areas, some of which have fountains coming out of it. And there's a whole set of programming that goes along with this as well, so that the place feels as comfortable when there are only a few people out there as when there are crowds out there as well. Here we're using larger wooden surfaces, some of which kind of tilt up and get you out over the water to give you a perch looking out toward the water. These sorts of spaces have been commandeered by rogue yoga classes in the morning. We're told that if you can get a yoga class to show up at one of your landscape projects without notice, you've designed a pretty successful project. Also areas where these wooden slopes slope down to the water to really give people access down to the water. Some of those slopes, some of those step down, but the whole idea is to really feature the waterfront, to activate it, to give people opportunities to get down to the water, and to give people in boats opportunities to get back up into the city as well. And of course, these floating docks become walkways, stages, and watching areas as well, gathering spaces as well. Planting here was tricky. Every square inch needed to be paved. So how you then plant within a context like that is quite tricky. The entire surface, or much of the surface, is a permeable paver that allows water to infiltrate. So we're watering all the roots, high-tech soils, structural soils, again, beneath the surface. We also use grade changes to allow for infiltration of other water underneath some of the benches. So where this light is emanating from under the bench, there's a slot that's doing a lot of work collecting a lot of the storm water and infiltrating it into the ground. The lighting itself then becomes a kind of celebratory thing that changes over the course of the evening. And it's become a place that crowds now come to because there's something to do, there's a place to hang out. And the city, in conjunction with a number of nonprofits, have started to program the space with year-round activity so that people keep coming back and activating that space. In that line, we're working on a new project at the University of Michigan. This is a new campus quad at the heart of the North Campus. The main campus you can see here in the distance. The expansion campus will be here on the North Quad. On this quad, you currently have a lot of engineering buildings. The architecture building is there. There's a new performing arts center, but it's also meant to be the new center of university expansion. So this quad will become the new center of campus life on the North Quad. It's a simple quad, but it's really kind of monofunctional. It's meant to get people from one place to another through the quad. And the university was interested in activating this in some way, and the engineering school dean was interested in the role that technology might play in activating that space as well. So we're redesigning the space in order to activate it in a number of ways. This is a 4-acre space as opposed to Harvard's 1-acre space. This is a space that will remain predominantly green. It will still accommodate a lot of the circulation that moves through that space. But we've done a number of things that are somewhat subtle but are amplified here. First of all, instead of straight paths, we've designed paths that kind of have these areas that kind of allow the path to grow a lot larger and to create little gathering spaces along the path. We've also designed a series of landforms to give you a little bit of height, a little bit of contour, but also to give students a place to kind of hang out and watch the activity that's going on along the plaza. The engineering school's good at programming with a lot of their robots and experiments. They will often use this space as a place to showcase the work that they're doing in the school. But it's also a space at the center that becomes a flexible space for different kinds of activities. Here you see it kind of normal day. Here you see it where there might be a bigger concert going on, or opening school fair kind of event, or even when you import an ice skating rink and make a winter festival. So in a lot of the same ways, at the center, we're designing something that's really quite flexible, that has all the infrastructure that it needs, but in combination with a lot of the other techniques, we're creating a space that's good for people to hang out at the everyday, but also allows for different kinds of activities to play themselves out over the course of the year. The twist on this, though, is yet another question that we've been working on in the practice. How is it that we connect environment, technology, and people in meaningful ways? We wanted to move beyond the stormwater infiltration garden, which has been done over and over again, and somehow make that process of capturing and collecting stormwater resonate with people. We have 5 different stormwater gardens. You can see them here. These are larch trees, here, 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 and I'm missing one, behind the tower. So there are 5 of them. Essentially, they're collecting all the stormwater from the site into these gardens, which are prickly larch with ferns and other plantings down below. But what we've done is introduced lighting, environmentally responsive lighting within each of the gardens. And the idea there is that every time it rains and the stormwater moves into the garden, these lights will flicker, giving a lighting effect that starts to signal to people what's going on there in terms of what's happening in the environment. So it's a way to bring to life this environmental process through technology in very, very simple ways. We're also working on a project in Toronto. This is a plaza associated with a new development project on a very, very windy site. These are all the wind diagrams that just take my word, it's windy. And what we wanted to do was actually use that. So we're starting to design these poles that'll twist in the wind, twist just enough to generate enough electricity to illuminate the pole. So in the same way that the stormwater garden is bringing to life a water effect, here we're trying to bring to life the wind effect, so that there's a pulse, a life of the plaza that goes beyond the social and links into a bigger environmental issue. We're also experimenting with some floating wetlands that feed fish, and when the fish feed, there's also a twinkling effect on the wetlands. This one is part of a project. This project we just lost. It was a competition, so there's still a lot of sad people in the office right now. But this is one where we try to use various technologies to really play with environmental phenomena. This is on the lakefront in Toronto, where they do get a lot of fog, on a site that's sort of a viewport. It's also a ferry terminal for getting from downtown to the islands out in Toronto Harbor. You know, they're very simple things, like you can't see anything, the wayfinding's terrible, the existing site is not well designed, so there are ways that we're opening up views and all that sort of thing. But we wanted to tap into the kind of island culture a bit, where, you know, there's some great outdoor life year-round, but there's also been a history of spectacles. I love this one, the horse jumping off into the lake. Some of that continues, not the horses, but there still is an amusement park out there. There's some great creeks and gardens. There's even a nude beach. There's a gay beach, and there's a nude gay beach. And you're welcome to go to any of them. We also wanted to create this fantastical place that really played off of and played with the environment, and use that as a way to kind of immerse people in a set of environmental conditions that would have a real kind of impact. And so this project we called Cloud Park, and we thought of the cloud in a number of ways, thinking about the way that we could use not only environmental effects, but created environmental effects to really condition the way that people would experience this place throughout the seasons. We started with a fog gateway as you would enter the park. There's an old bridge here. And so we wanted to create a cloud gateway that would begin to change and evolve as the wind blew, as the weather changed, and would really create this dramatic marker on the one hand. We thought in many ways of the tree canopy as its own form of light cloud of foliage here that would intensify in certain ways. It would dissipate as you move to the center, but we could choreograph the fall foliage of the trees so that the most colorful trees were at the center of the space. We also looked at a water and ice plaza that would mist during the summer and create some warm fog for ice skating during the winter. We set up a series of floating pools in the basins to create places not only to look over the basin, but to actually get into the basin. Here are the floating wetlands, floating swimming pools. Here you can see some of the steamy swimming pools, misting to cool people during the summer months, illuminated at night to create a dramatic effect, and a series of floating hot tubs that would allow people to be in the lake in the winter, bathing in a hot tub with some friends. I'd go there. And also to realize that the environmental phenomenon can be the marker itself. Everyone kept asking, well, next to this skyline and these big buildings, what are you going to do? Rather than create a thing, we were creating a spectacle out of the fog itself, so something that would constantly change and evolve with the environmental conditions. So again, how do we bring the environment to life using technology? We also do a lot of work with design and fabrication techniques. I'm going to skip over this one. We design a lot of furniture. You've seen that. We use a lot of new software techniques in order to design these things, because instead of creating a single bench, we can create a number of different bench conditions very quickly using these techniques. And then those software programs fit quite comfortably with the way fabricators work now. So on the benches at Harvard, you can see there's a lot of testing that we do in terms of the initial form making, the evolution of how these things are put together, how they work. And on this, each of those, what looks like 29 different benches is actually only 7 different benches, but each rib on each bench is different. They all taper in a particular way, which seems complicated, except all of that can be computer generated in the fabricator shop. Also, if one of them gets damaged, they're all numbered. So all they have to do is lift it out, call up the number, remake one of those ribs according to the number, and it's a fairly easy fix. At the University of Michigan, we're doing a different kind of bench. This is a snaky bench. That kind of starts at a curb, becomes a seat wall, then becomes a bench. Here you can see some of the sinuous forms. Again, we do a lot of the testing digitally, but then we also, these models just came yesterday to the office. So you can see we're testing form, shape, fabrication techniques, the way people sit, the way people can be agitated while they're on the phone, the way she can be quite relaxed there. These are going to be embedded within the landscape, within landforms, so we're also testing the way that they interact with the landforms that we've designed there. And then all of these, it's essentially a kit of parts. These are all the extended benches, all the different modules that can then be recombined to make each of the different variations. So it's a very systematic process. It allows for customization because of the computer software, and it's one that's allowing us to explore new techniques, primarily right now with furnishings, but we can begin to imagine how that's going to impact some of the other work that we're doing. And my final question, how can we enroll landscape to reorganize and shape cities? We're not the first people to ask this question. Frederick Law Olmsted was asking this question in the late 19th century. This is the Boston Park system, the Emerald Necklace. And to me, these aren't landscape projects. These are city-making projects. These are projects that involved flood control. They involved new forms, new pieces of transportation infrastructure. This is a light rail system. You can see all the parkways that were designed around the fens as well. And so this is a system of landscape that's meant to open up new parts of the city for development. So in a lot of ways, it goes far beyond the recreational and even environmental agendas of a simple public park. These, in my mind, are city-making projects. And we've been doing the city-making projects for a long time. In fact, we've, in many ways, built our reputation off of losing competition entries. This is one of the first biggest competitions we lost, probably about 8 years ago. This is also in Toronto. We're getting really good at losing competitions in Toronto. But this is the mouth of a river that in some ways had been congested and crammed up and denuded. And the client both wanted to open up the river again, but also create some new urban neighborhoods. For us, it was a matter of not figuring out the city first and then giving the leftover space to landscape. It was really figuring out the river and the river ecologies. In fact, we spent a lot of time learning the breeding habits of fish in order to begin to understand how this particular kind of river mouth needed to work, and then we built a city system around it. We've done work in China. This is Shanghai, a big development parcel here, where again we're using a simple technique of landscape, using landscape to frame out the building plots in white. Starting first with the water, this is the big river, but there are a number of creeks moving through this. How is it that we can create water-oriented landscapes as a first move? Water gardens, larger scale water landscapes. How is it that we use green landscape fingers to structure the new neighborhoods that would come? And you can see those neighborhoods are quite intense. I forget the anticipated population for this new development, but it was somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million new people. They don't kid around in China. But also the notion that each of those fingers could then be programmed differently. So in one of them, you could have larger scale sports and athletic facilities and bigger ceremonial landscapes. In others, you could have more neighborhood recreation activities. In others, you might have cultural facilities, et cetera, et cetera. But it was really this idea of fingers of landscape that would then structure individualized neighborhood where nobody had to walk more than 2 blocks to get to a big public landscape. That's a radical idea for China. I think the plan that we inherited put all the development essentially over here and all the park over here. We ended up with the same percentage of park and landscape, but completely refigured the way that portion of the city. You know what? We won that one, and even when we win, we lose. So this one we worked on with SOM. It was a developer competition. Phil Enquist out of Chicago was the lead on it. We went over, we won it, didn't hear anything. 3 weeks later, he called them and said, hey, what's going on? We're getting on to the master plan phase now, right? And they said, no, thank you, we're building it. They're already, from our little booklet, laying out the roads and starting construction on it. So I don't know. Who knows what it looks like? So we won, but we lost. And then the final project I'll show you. This is 500 acres in Dallas. This is downtown Dallas. This is the Trinity River. The Trinity River used to be over here, but it flooded downtown in the early 20th century, so they moved the river over here. Now they miss the river, and now they want to be reconnected to the river. The problem is, this is the stuff that was put in between downtown and the river. It's an absolute tangled mess of highway infrastructure, rail infrastructure, and all this other stuff. It also has donkeys. This is the best form of mixed-use development I've come across. This is a car wash and a truck stop and a taco stand and fields to raise donkeys, longhorn, cattle, and not in this picture, zebras. And so there's a quirkiness to Dallas that we were quite intrigued by. The simple question, how do you connect the river to the city? First you do it not by creating pedestrian connections, but by literally extending the city fabric directly to the river, and then taking the river landscape and bringing it back into the city. Very simple strategy, like the Shanghai strategy, that gives you this grid green rhythm that sets up new neighborhoods interspersed with lush landscapes. Landscapes that, frankly, would be built around some of the more difficult sites with the highway interchanges. So landscape in this way was being used to clean the air around the highways and to, frankly, just get it out of people's view. And then to use moments like this to cross over and build neighborhoods directly across the river. The landscapes themselves would be programmed in a way that with programs that were bigger than your normal civic plaza in the city, but smaller than big nature. So art walks, art forests to be able to display sculpture larger than you could get in a gallery, and also other kinds of activities, raves, nightclubs beneath the interchanges. We also wanted to revive the old river. Parts of the old river system still existed as the stormwater collection system for the city before that water was then pumped inside the levees into the river itself. We wanted to bring that back to life, but of course it had to be a highly engineered system because it was collecting water from half the city. It was bad quality water, so we developed a system of water gardens, water cleansing wetlands that would upgrade the quality of that water and then use the water once it's clean to become the centerpiece of each of the three new neighborhoods. So in the south, we had a set of aviary and music gardens, some of which would be fed off, again, runoff and potentially gray water from the building systems to set up a lush new landscape in the middle of a new mixed-use development with cultural institutions. This is the landscape piece of it at the heart of that new neighborhood. And here you see it as a mixed-use neighborhood, some commercial, mostly residential, with connections to existing neighborhoods back here with these lush new music and water gardens as a center point. In the north area, we designed a beach. We figured it's 95 degrees in Dallas a lot. Why not have a beach in the middle of the city, a place to kind of shed your inhibitions, but to do it overlooking the river on the one hand, but also in a place surrounded by the city with your own swimming beach and pool made from the clean water of the stormwater system. This would be a neighborhood that would be design and art oriented, but also very mixed use. And then finally, a water amphitheater, a new celebratory space for civic life, right at the center of some of the most intense development, but that would become the central focal point, not only for that neighborhood, but really for all the city. On the other side, where it connected to downtown, a new water plaza. This is the existing train station with a new high-speed rail station as well. So the project was also about making connections to other parts of the city and other parts of the state as well. So three unique neighborhoods really organized by landscape, with landscape as the centerpiece, with a whole set of connections to existing neighborhoods, interconnected via public transportation, and then connected beyond the site to the city. In all, this is a project that's meant to be developed incrementally and opportunistically. It starts with a series of artistic installations that just grab your attention and get people down there, sort of celebrate this place along the river. It also begins with a set of nursery installations and events, getting people used to the idea of going down to the riverfront. All this takes place while a lot of the more complicated planning and zoning and property deals are arranged. But there's also an idea that you invest a little bit at a time, a little bit in the stormwater system. Those initial investments then become the center for private development to make their own investments, and then you begin to build on each of those investments and go back and forth between the public and private realm. This doesn't require a one end to the other phasing strategy. It can be very opportunistic and can kind of react over time in ways that allow the project to continue to move, allow the client to build successes over time, and incrementally over a period of 20 to 30 to 40 years begin to realize this new idea of Dallas, this new idea of a city framed by and integrated with its landscape. Now, there are many other questions that we're dealing with as well. Food, how can we use food in landscapes? How can we use more tactical approaches to urbanism? I'll leave those questions for a different day. In all, though, I keep coming back to the question that we posed years and years ago when we started the firm. How is it that landscape might play a more prominent and formative role in the imagining and remaking of public spaces, infrastructures, and entire cities. Hopefully, I've given you a little glimpse of how we're currently thinking about answering that question in a number of ways. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions. And I know the first one's always the hardest one. Right here.
What did you need to do to utilize blowdown or the condensate?
We're still working on that one. That's a project that I proposed to a developer in Dubai a week and a half ago. So that's one where we have a little bit of the sense of what the engineering technologies are, and now it's time to kind of dive in. On the previous version, where we were proposing the gray water system to utilize the mangrove, that project happened about 8 years ago. It was just before the economic bust. So the project was never realized, but we had gotten a long way down the line in figuring out with the engineer how exactly that system worked. In fact, in Dubai, they use a lot of recycled gray water for landscape systems now. So what's an unusual thing, perhaps, in the States is not so unusual in places where they're really strapped for resources like that.
Yeah,
What's it?
it's those environments that the more hostile the environment, the more blowdown water there is.
Yeah.
It seems like an enormous resource.
Exactly.
That has toxic issues.
Yeah, and so you would integrate, I mean, you wouldn't do it quite as simply as I showed it to you. You would integrate filtration processes and all of that as an initial stage to get that water quality where it needed to be in order that it would be safe for human contact. Yeah.
In a project as large as the Dallas one that you showed, you mentioned the word opportunistic. So obviously the large-scale renderings you were showing were just an idea of one of the many possibilities that it might become, and it's the kind of project which would probably take 50 or 100 years to materialize. So in that case, how much of the plan do you try to control, and how much of it do you just realize that it's going to be what it is and it might be something else altogether?
Yeah, well, Dallas is interesting because they don't have planning culture and they don't have big government. It's Texas, right? What they do have is this unique coalition of philanthropy, private development, and resources that are then brought to the city. There's an urban design studio that sits in City Hall that essentially acts as the city's planning arm, but it's 100% funded by philanthropy. The Arts District, which has been built out over the last 5-10 years in Dallas, has been philanthropy motivated. And it's the folks in the philanthropic community who are now working with developers and pushing the city to do good work in the city. So we've been working with that urban design studio, essentially saying, okay, what's the low-hanging fruit? Where are there developers that want to do things? In fact, that whole southern piece of the project, this one, wasn't inside the boundary of the competition. It was just outside, but we had heard there was a developer that owned this big piece of land. So we were being opportunistic even by including it in. And in fact, they were the first ones to fund continuing work on that project, not only to figure out the water system, but to figure out this entire neighborhood. How do you lay that out? And that then went through a set of planning and urban design exercises at the same time that we were working with the water engineers to figure out the water system. So in that case, the final plan won't look exactly like what we had drawn, but it adheres to some of the same principles, and we're using it as the first step toward implementing the plan. At the same time, we're working with a number of organizations to plant the trees in the nurseries that'll become the forest for the landscape. So we're kind of, it's not one where there's a lot of large-scale coordination, so it's how do you pick up individualized projects, how do you know where there are developers ready to go, and then through the city, through the urban design studio, how do we begin to work with them? It's a strange way to work, but it's starting to work for them in an odd way. And in fact, this competition we won. And then we waited 6 months to do anything. And then we had this one contract, and now we're waiting again. But that's how things go. This one, I lost my train of thought now. I got so excited that we finally won one.
It's a strange way to work, but it's working slowly, you said, or it's starting to work.
It is. It is. And one of the things that we built our plan on, that's right, thanks. We were being very pragmatic. We identified the 3 biggest developers in town, where they owned property, and made sure that the neighborhoods that we proposed coincided with where they owned property. I mean, very simple things. We're also understanding that it's really hard to build a city neighborhood on top of a big clover leaf. And at the same time, we weren't going to wish that clover leaf away. It's Texas, right? Our solution to fewer highways in Texas is building walkable neighborhoods where you can walk into downtown, and therefore the reliance on the car falls. And over time, again, highway use, hopefully, will come down. There were other schemes that were quite beautiful, some led by European designers that said, oh, these highways, just take them away. And we kept saying, no, it's Texas. They love their cars, they love their pickup trucks, and we're down with that. We're gonna do something that works for Dallas and work within the system that they've given us. Yeah.
On a mundane level, do you happen to know the material you used for those benches?
Which ones?
The ones that were
The wood ones?
generated?
Yep, at Harvard. They're an Alaskan yellow cedar that doesn't come from Alaska. In fact, it was overstocked from a museum project next door. So I always say it comes from Newburyport. The truth is it probably comes from the Midwest, but it's a very durable wood. It's quite dense, but it's also a renewable wood. The wood of choice for a while had been ipe, which is a Brazilian hardwood, that if you get certified, it's properly grown and managed and all that. The problem is it's impossible almost to get certified ipe, so people are starting to not use that anymore and find other native woods that are more durable. It's a great hardwood though.
You showed some examples of projects that seem to function and really light up just as well with a few people as with large events and crowds. What are some of the moves that you use to make sure that a space can function in those ways?
A lot of it's scaling. I come from Boston, and in Boston in the 60s, they did City Hall Plaza, where they wiped out some neighborhoods, and then they built the new government center, city, state, federal buildings, and then put this really big plaza in the middle of it all, without a lot of articulation to it, except steps and brick. And it is the whipping boy of all public projects in Boston. And so whenever you're doing public space, the question is, are you making another City Hall Plaza? And there were people that were fearing that we were, even though I think this is about a third the size. And we were scaling it. So where we could on the edges with those garden groves, we were making sure that we were developing a set of secondary spaces with vegetation that would start to lean over the central plaza. But we were also making sure that even though we had to design for that big tent, we weren't giving that tent much space. We were really fitting it in and then almost jamming things up to it to make sure that even when it was there, people could use the other stuff, and it would really intensify that. But the other piece of it is designing for the everyday with the seating and doing some of the other sort of light programming to make sure that there was always something there to do for people. Yes?
You showed a project where you talked about I think it was the rain that would make the lights sort of twinkle. So what's the technology for that? What makes the lights twinkle?
Well, so we have two different technologies. One was old school. I have this British guy who has 10 years experience, and he's quite a great guy. He's a bit of a romantic. So he first had this idea that we would have a water wheel that would turn and it would start to illuminate, except that we would have multiple water wheels because we wanted the lights to sort of flicker independently. That mechanically is difficult, and the university is sort of scowling at us while we're talking about water wheels. What we're doing is actually going to a rain sensor technology like you get with irrigation systems. Very, very simple. It's a technology that exists. And so when it rains, you'll get a flicker.
In conjunction with that question, what about those wind towers that you put up that would light up?
Yep. That would be very simple LED. In fact, we had started to work out a similar system for a different project, also a competition, also that we lost. That one was a beautiful project. We were working with a firm called Howler & Yoon out of Boston. They do very nice work. And we're working with them just so that, all we would have within the pole would be simple LED fixtures, which don't require a lot of energy anyway. So we wouldn't be generating a lot of energy from the pole twisting, but we were generating enough to be able to illuminate it. In that project where we're collaborating with them, I think we had 3 different poles. One of them actually flickered back and forth, and that kind of movement would also generate enough energy to illuminate it in a different way. Mostly simple technologies. The question is how to make them surefire, weatherproof, all those sorts of things for a public environment. It's one of the things that when we're working with architects who often work on interiors, we're having to remind them that no, we're outside, not inside, and we're in the public realm, and there's a whole other level of safety precaution that you have to build into these things.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay, thank you, Chris. Okay.
Oh, we do have one.
One more.
No, I had lunch at that Harvard Square, and I thought the most animating thing about it was the 3 food trucks.
Yeah.
So,
Told you, food. You give
Yeah.
people food.
I mean, I never believed that Harvard could actually allow food trucks on its hallowed
Yeah.
property. I mean, was that part of your programming with Harvard?
Absolutely. And in fact, we had the opportunity with them to program the site before construction started. So we did a lot of test programming, set a stage up here or here or here, move food trucks around. And so that was a great way to learn so that we could then, as we were designing, take that knowledge into account. It's been an amazingly successful space. It's really the president's initiative, Drew Faust, who initially wanted to find ways academically for the schools to collaborate. And once she started that, she was very interested in socially how to bring people together. And that project is really the first of a number of projects to come.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks everyone.